All right. Well, good morning. Welcome, everybody. My name is Susanna Calkins, and I'm the director of the Nexus for Faculty Success. And along with my two WISH co-chairs, Dr. Lise Elliott and Christine Burgess, I'm delighted to welcome you to this spring seminar. Each year, the advisory committee selects a special theme. And in this 9th year of WISH, we've been examining gender roles under the microscope. And many of you have already joined us for some of the insightful conversations that we've already had this year in September's symposium featuring Dr. Amy Deal and the winter seminar featuring Dr. Lynn Bian. Before I introduce today's speaker, Dr. Corrine Moss-Racusin, I would like to first thank the WISH Advisory Committee, some of whom are here or online. Thank you very much. As well as our planning committee, who's worked very hard this year to put all of this together. I'd also like to announce that we have our CME credit. That today's session has been approved for the 2 credits of continuing education for today's clinician participants. There's a fine print on the slide, which I guess I should advance now. Here, let's see. Wow. And we'll see what else. We'll just go this quickly again. Here's our thanks. Here we are. Okay. And our thanks to our committee. Perfect. And now we have this CME slide where there's a lot of fine print here. But this session has been approved for 2 credits for continuing education for today's clinician participants. This fine print says it goes through the learning objectives, which you've already received in advance, and it notes that neither today's speaker nor any of our organizers have conflicts of interest with the material being presented. Okay. But it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Corinne Moss-Racusin is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Skidmore College. She earned her BA from New York University and her PhD from Rutgers University and did her postdoctoral work at Yale University. Her work focuses on ways in which stereotypes contribute to inequality and perpetuate occupational gender segregation, focusing in particular on how gender bias pervades STEM fields. Her research has been funded by the NSF, APA, and the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, as well as the Smithsonian Institution. She's published in many important journals, including Science, Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. She has been honored with numerous awards, including APA's Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution to Psychology and the APS Rising Star Award. She was even invited to present her work at the White House. I won't ask which one, but, but we're very delighted that she's presenting here today at RFU. So please help me welcome today's speaker, Dr. Corinne Moss-Racusin, for her talk, Understanding and Reducing Gender Bias in STEM and Healthcare. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for being here during a busy time, and welcome also to those online. I have really been looking forward to the opportunity to chat with you about some of my work on these topics. So I want to begin today by sharing with you a case study that some of you may be familiar with about some of the real world situations that inspired this program of research for me. So I want to talk to you about the development of crash test dummies. Now, the fact that we do some testing of car safety is a good thing, but there was originally a team that had to develop the prototype for the dummies that are used in that crash testing. That team at the time was gender homogenous. So it was all men who worked on that team. And they designed the first crash test dummy with the prototype in mind, the schema that they had in their mind for the person who's usually driving the family car. So who do we think that was at that time? It was a male body. And of interest, female crash test dummies were not developed until several decades later and are still only required to be used in the passenger seat when doing car safety testing. Now, why do I bring this up? Unfortunately, there were some consequences to the constrained vision of how technology would play out in these kinds of situations. And a study that was released a few years ago indicates that cars that received a 5-star safety rating for male drivers in practice would only have received about a 2-star rating for female drivers, and that there was a 40% additional fatality rate when women were in that seat. Now, why do I start to talk like this with this particular case study? It's to highlight the ways in which a lack of diversity in a particular room, or whether the ideas of the people in that room might be constrained by ideas from the broader culture, can have consequences not only for who is allowed or invited or celebrated being in certain rooms, but also for the quality of the product that is coming out of those rooms. And for folks like this community where we're really invested in doing the best basic and medical sciences possible, there are reasons to be concerned about the ways in which these broader cultural expectations could be constraining opportunities, not only for individual scientists and healthcare providers, but for the work and the conversations that they are also involved in. So let me give you a brief sense for where we will go during our time together today, what I'll be covering. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background. I'm going to share some evidence of gender disparities, as well as the role that stereotypes might be playing in those disparities. And then I'm going to tell you about some of my work demonstrating biases within a STEM context, and then really focusing on some newer work looking at the consequences of those biases for people's choices about what careers and areas they would like to pursue. I will also share with you some new and ongoing work, testing and intervention designed to reduce these biases, particularly within a STEM context. So that's where we're headed today. Now, I want to start in talking about some of this background by asking for your predictions. So folks may be familiar with some of these contexts. I would love to know what, if you had to guess, what percent of physics Nobel laureates would you say over the course of the award have been women? So there's 227 in total as of today. The 2025 awards have not yet been awarded, as you likely know. So what, if you had to guess, what percent do we think of these folks are women? What do we think? 1%, 15%, 2%. Anyone want to be wildly optimistic? 15 is wild optimism. Unfortunately, I agree with you. And I'll give you one more item. What percent do we think for the chemistry laureates, a field where there's a little bit less of a disparity? 5, 10, 4, you're up to 4, from 1 to 4. 22. My goodness, wild optimism indeed. So let me show you the data. In physics, we are at under 2%, so 5 women total. I know, and now many of us are going to have a confusing reaction where we're excited that we got it right, but then sort of sad for what that means in the world. So we're at 2%, only 5 women in the history of this award for chemistry. We are at just about 4%, so we can celebrate. I will surprise you with also the data on medicine. So we are at just under 6% for medicine, 13 women in the history of that award. Now, again, why do I bring this up? Why do I highlight this disparity? It's not at all to undermine the groundbreaking, incredible scientific achievements of the folks that are receiving these accolades, but instead to highlight the ways in which, despite some progress, there's still quite a bit of gender segregation at these very highest levels of scientific achievement, reward, and recognition. So what could be going on here? Now, if we look at the data a bit more formally, they bear out some of these trends. So these are, I'm now showing you the percent of undergraduate degrees going to women across many different kinds of STEM fields. There's a lot going on in this graph over a 15-year period. This is the 15 years for which we have the most recent data, but the new data which will come out this year show a similar pattern. So you might notice something like my field of psychology, women are receiving about 80% of those undergraduate degrees. But what you might also see is that there are some fields like computer sciences where women's participation has flattened a bit over time, and somewhere their participation is actually dropping off, like engineering. And so these data also were collected during a time where lots of folks and lots of funding mechanisms were devoted to trying to think about how can we remove barriers to women's full participation. So if anything, we would really want to see these lines increasing to reflect genuine diversity and interest and skill and capacity. And that is not the trend that we see formally in these data. Faculty data show a similar pattern. So here now I'm showing you the percent of faculty across all different kinds of institutions that are male relative to female. So you can see from R1 institutions all the way over to med schools, we're still seeing that women are underrepresented at the faculty level relative to men. So the questions really are why? What's going on? What are some of the factors, and I really want to emphasize multiple factors, that could be contributing to these kinds of disparities? And what are the implications? So initially, as many of you in the room may know, folks were really interested in the potential role of intrinsic ability differences. So the hypothesis was perhaps it's the case that women somehow biologically or inherently lack the capacity to succeed in these kinds of math-intensive, very competitive fields. I don't think I have to spend a ton of time convincing folks in this room that there's very little evidence to support this hypothesis, that this difference is inevitable or inborn in some way. Lots of meta-analyses have suggested that this is probably not what is accounting for the types of broad disparities that I've been showing you in the past couple of slides. So researchers then got really interested in the potential role of what they called lifestyle choices. And this is basically preference. So maybe it's the case that women simply prefer careers outside of STEM. Maybe men prefer careers outside of the sort of caregiving professions, and that this is just something sort of inherent. But lots of folks, myself included, have really pushed this idea of trying to think about what do we mean when we say choice? To what extent is a choice free, authentic, and matching capacity, and to what extent is it perhaps constrained by some societal expectations or gendered stereotypes about who is great at different kinds of work? There is some correlational evidence to support the idea that perhaps women are reporting that they're less interested in STEM than men. But I've really asked in my work, and I'll show you some of these studies, to what extent is that inevitable, right? To what extent is it fluid or malleable, that interest might be in response to the quality of the climate that folks can anticipate in certain domains. And so as an early postdoc, I asked the question, is there a role of gender bias playing out here in people's selection into different fields? And by that, what I meant, and I assumed that there would have been research on already, but was interested to see the state of the literature. I wondered whether identically qualified male and female science students would be evaluated identically. Would they be judged as equally competent, equally likely to advance? Would they receive the same types of mentoring? Or might there be a biasing role of gender stereotypes? So what do I mean by this? I'm going to answer this question, I'm going to distill the social science literature on gender stereotypes, which is, decades and hundreds and thousands of studies, into one slide in about 2 minutes. So please feel free to jump in with questions if there are things that I can clarify. Broadly in this area of work, we notice that there's a discrepancy between the traits that people tend to ascribe to women and the expectations they have of women versus the traits that they tend to ascribe to men and to scientists. So broadly, we find that women are expected to be what we refer to as communal, so kind, supportive, nurturing, focused on offering care, maybe focused on the family and those interpersonal relations more so than the work environment. Whereas men are expected to be what we call agentic, so analytic, ambitious, risk-taking, independent, self-promoting, and really focused on the career and paid work outside the home. Now, if you think about the traits that you would maybe intuitively or stereotypically associate with a great scientist, you might think, oh, there's a really neat overlap between those agentic traits and what I think of as necessary to excel in the sciences, and maybe a perceived disconnect between some of those communal traits, right? I've heard people in focus groups often say, well, we want our scientists and our healthcare providers to be able to be analytic, right? To be focused on the career, not distracted by relationships. We don't want them to be overly modest, right? Or focused more so on the home. Their head is elsewhere. So this is not, I'm not suggesting that this is an accurate perception, but there is this broader cultural stereotypic piece that maybe these masculine traits and skills are a better fit for a STEM context than these more feminized perceived traits. And so lots of work has demonstrated that this perception is very widespread, right? Across different cultural contexts and across time. We're finding very robust, both self-report data and more automatic or implicit data suggesting that people have a stronger association between men and science and women in liberal arts than the opposite, and that these gut level stereotypes really matter. So here's a study demonstrating that people's automatic gendering of STEM is predicted of nation level achievement gap data. So the extent to which people are thinking of STEM as more male than female is predictive of gaps in achievement of actual students at the country level. So we think that these factors are really impactful, but we did not yet have clear evidence that there might be gender bias playing out in STEM. We had evidence to suggest that this seemed likely to me as a relatively naive postdoc, assuming that this work might already have been done. But there was a report that came out of MIT that was really influential, suggesting that resources were distributed inequitably between men and women in academia. Women were given access to poorer lab space or were disproportionately assigned to really intensive committee work, leaving less time for research and grant writing. Unfortunately, many folks in the room are knowingly shaking their heads yes at me. And this is an interesting piece. There's tons of experimental evidence from within my field of social psychology and related fields demonstrating that people encounter biases when they are violating gender stereotypes. And this is the case for people across the gender identity spectrum, including men in more feminized, traditionally feminized occupations. Also, there's lots of self-report data that women in STEM are saying that they are encountering biases from both their classmates and their mentors and faculty members. But there had yet to be a really clear, clean experimental test for whether this was the case in STEM. And I will share with you, just human to humans today, that when I arrived at Yale for my postdoc, I was doing a lot of focus groups with faculty members, and these were the types of data that I could show them. And they pushed back really hard. The idea was, well, we're trained to be really analytic. We are trained to be data-driven. We are trained to be objective. We would not show these biases. They might be happening in corporate America. They might be happening when people are discriminating against men who are applying for early elementary positions, but they're not happening here because we are scientists and we just care about the data at hand. And I thought that's a really beautiful thought, but I don't have as much faith in meritocracy as y'all do in the moment. So, but it's an empirical test, right? It's an empirical question. And so that is the piece that I set out to explore in this first piece of work that I will be telling you about. I'll tell you about this briefly because this is an older study, and then I really want to build on this in the research that I share with you today. So in this first study, we were asking a really simple question: would STEM faculty members demonstrate gender biases towards students in STEM? So folks may have heard about this study. It was received a lot of attention in the media as the John Jennifer paper, but we got our participants in this study were STEM faculty members from institutions all around the US. They were representative of the broader underlying population, so we can generalize from this sample with some confidence. And the design here is really simple. We told our faculty participants that we wanted them to evaluate the CV and the application materials of a student who had actually applied to be a lab manager somewhere in the US over the course of the last year, and their feedback would be shared with the student. So there were some consequences of their evaluation. For half of our faculty participants, we said that this candidate was John, and we developed these materials in partnership with colleagues in these STEM fields. And for the other half of participants, we said that the applicant was Jennifer. Now you can see across these two conditions, the qualifications are identical, right? All that differs is the gender, John, Jennifer, and the gendered pronouns. Now we did actually pre-test these profiles, and these names, the names John and Jennifer, were rated as equivalently recognizable, equally likable names, equally intelligent sounding names. So any differences in how faculty are responding to John versus Jennifer is a product of what? Merely their gender, right? There's nothing else that differs across these conditions. And to clarify, this is a between subjects design such that participants are only seeing John or Jennifer. They don't see both, right? So if they are judging them differently, it is as a function of the student's gender. And unfortunately, what we find is strong experimental evidence of gender bias. When comparing apples to apples, they are not both rated as apples or as equivalently wonderful apples. So we use scales from the literature measuring perceived competence, hireability, and mentoring, the extent to which they would offer mentoring to these students. And when the student is described as Jennifer, she is routinely downgraded. She is viewed as less competent. She is less likely to be hired, and she's less likely to receive needed professional mentoring relative to the identically qualified student described as John. She's also offered a lower starting salary. So there's about a $4,000 per year gap in this initial starting salary, but we know that most raises are based on what? Historic salary and a percentage of your current salary. So this initial difference would likely widen and accumulate over time and actually matches historic data in lifetime gender pay gaps. I will note that we did not find in this study any evidence of an impact of faculty members' own gender or other demographics. So how their age, what specific subfield of science they were in. So in other words, we're not finding that only male faculty are driving this effect, or only chemists, or only older folks, or only white folks. This seemed to be a fairly pervasive effect. Folks are sort of equally exposed to these very pervasive cultural stereotypes and seem to be acting upon them in similar ways. So I'm going to offer a working summary as we go through today. So far, I've shown you the first experimental evidence of faculty member gender biases in STEM. I will say that these results have been replicated by numerous other labs at this point. So there's evidence that physics faculty members are impacted by both gender and racialized biases in evaluating postdoctoral candidates. A couple of other different contexts from other labs showing this same pattern of preferential evaluation for a male target relative to the identically qualified female target. And I'll highlight again that this was not driven by a particular subgroup of participants, and rather it appears to me a more broader sort of cognitive and social process throughout our population of participants. And I would argue, I'm going to spend some time on this in the next section of the talk, that this could have both a direct and an indirect impact on the kinds of disparities that I've been showing you, right? So it could have a direct impact if individual women are encountering really overt instances of gender bias that might make them choose another career. But it could also have an indirect effect in terms of sensing which areas are welcoming and reinforcing and which areas are chillier or frostier. And I think regardless of individual preferences or choices for your constraint, we can probably all agree that equally qualified candidates should be evaluated equally. And unfortunately, now we have evidence with faculty members who are interacting with these students on a daily basis that that is in fact not the case, that there is this biasing role of gender stereotypes. So this leads us to the next area of research that I want to share with you. And to do that, to share with you this question that spurred this next area of thinking about consequences, I want to briefly share some quotes from, I had a really creative thesis student a couple of years ago that produced an award-winning documentary about the science of gender socialization in kids. So he interviewed a bunch of faculty members, and then also we brought kids into the lab to do a test that some of you may have heard of, the Draw Scientist test. We did a version of this where we simply asked children of all different age ranges, but they did have one thing in common. Their parents were psychology professors and thus highly recruitable. We asked them to draw, in our case, either a teacher or a firefighter. And we did not give them any gendered prompting. We just asked them, please draw these people, what comes to mind for you. Then we did structured interviews with those kids about their thought process and what was going on at age appropriate levels. So I want to share this one quote with you. So in this case, the interviewer asks the child, no need to be coy. This is my daughter, and I am the interviewer. So I said, can a man be a preschool teacher? She says, no. So let this be a lesson to you. Even mom being a gender scientist, it cannot insulate children from the broader culture. These processes are really robust. She says, no. Why? Teachers are girls because mamas are girls, and so kids like them better. A boy teacher wouldn't take care of a kid like if they get hurt and they're crying. Why not? Because I've never seen that, which is the greatest example of egocentrism that's from a cognitive perspective that I've ever seen. But also, they don't know to. So that's getting at knowledge and capacity and socialization. But let me share this snippet with her little best friend that I think really points us towards this next direction of research really clearly. So I said, can a man be a preschool teacher? Ha ha. Silence. What are you thinking? No, men's don't want to be teachers, so they don't work as teachers. Why don't they want to? Because none of their friends are. All of the other teachers are women's, so the men's would be embarrassed. Oh, they'd be embarrassed or actually worried. And this really taps into a lot of hypotheses that we've been interested in my lab and a lot of the work that I'll show you now, which is really looking at the consequences of knowing about the reality of gender biases and how they can contribute to occupational gender segregation. So let's look at this a little bit more formally, but I want to sort of show you the nexus of how kids are being impacted by some of this work. So in this line of research, we're really interested in what are the consequences of this reality, not just the disparities, right? Not just that there are differences in who is where, but that bias is playing a role in that. And people know that. So what happens next? So the question here is gender bias impacting? Is it one of the causes of engagement or lack thereof in counter-stereotypic fields? So is this one of the reasons that we are seeing disparities? I will share now one more sort of anecdotal tale with y'all here today. So after I published the study that I've just shown you, there was really robust conversation in the community that I was really gratified to be able to participate in. And some folks pushed back very hard and said, well, you've demonstrated that gender bias exists, but you haven't demonstrated that it matters. We think women just don't care. If they want to go into STEM, they just go into STEM. And that's just part of it. They're just going to dig in more. They're going to work harder. As a social psychologist, they think there's lots of reason to expect that people are in fact impacted by discrimination. But again, it's an empirical question. Let's find out. And it was a good point to highlight that we had not experimentally demonstrated a link between knowledge, okay, I will encounter bias in this field, but is that factoring into people's enthusiasm or choices? So that's what we look at in these studies that I'll tell you about now. In the very first one, these are adults from the general population. And here's what we did. We exposed them to, we utilized a real news article that covered the results of the first study that I showed you. So we took an article that just presented the results of that John Jennifer demonstrating gender bias paper. And in one condition, we just had them read the real article. And in the other condition, we altered that article to say that we had found no evidence of gender bias. So Jennifer was viewed just as well as John. So what we're trying to do here is manipulate the alleged existence of gender bias so we can then study its impact on people's enthusiasm for STEM. So here's a snippet of the original article. Here it is where we just doctored it to say, guess what? We found experimental evidence of equality. Of interest, of course, we pretest the heck out of this. And these articles are viewed as equally entertaining to read, equally credible. So people are basically very likely to believe whatever they read on the internet, which is its whole other important area of study that we should absolutely be talking about. And then we used several dependent variables, again, from the literature. We're measuring positive attitudes towards STEM, sense of belonging in STEM, and aspirations to actually go forward and participate in STEM. So here's what we find in this first study. For positive attitudes towards STEM, this is the condition, this is the gender bias condition. Now, let me remind you, gender bias condition meaning this is the real world. They read an actual article that was actually published about my actual research, right? And the green bars are male participants, the gray bar is female participants. So look what we see. Who's expressing more positive attitudes towards STEM? It's the male participants, right? And sometimes this is all we see. We see data like this saying, well, women are just less interested, right? It's a choice. It's up to them. This is a preference. We're not sure why, but hey, that's what it is. But look what happens when women can expect a fair situation, right? A playing field in which they will not encounter bias. Oh, suddenly their positive attitudes are indistinguishable from men's. What's going on with this interaction is just women's bars moving to where men's are. Men are fine either way, which is its own interesting line of work that I've pursued. But women are moving to where men are in the presence of gender fairness. We find the same pattern across DVs. Here's sense of belonging in STEM, right? So a robust gender gap in the presence of gender bias, which when I say it, sometimes it's like, yeah, right? There's a logic behind people's responsiveness to encountering discrimination. And that goes away when they can expect fair treatment. Same with this very behavioral measure of aspirations to actually participate in STEM. These are things like, if we were to offer you an online STEM course right now, might you want to take it? And we see a gap that is eliminated by the presence of egalitarianism or fairness here. So this was really interesting. And for folks, I'll very briefly say we were really interested in the process here. So I have some moderated mediation model data. I'm happy to chat about this more afterwards for any folks that are curious. But what we really find here is that the reason that women are expressing less positivity towards STEM than men is because of their sense of felt belonging. This relationship that's initially significant goes away when we account for their sense of belonging. So that is the variable that's really driving this process. That is a mediator here of, well, why do women feel less positive towards STEM than men? It's in part because they feel less sense of belonging. And of course, in the equality condition, we don't find the same pattern because there is no gender gap to explain in the equality condition. We find the same process, mediational pattern for our other outcome here, which is aspirations. The reason that women are expressing less STEM aspirations than men in the bias condition is because they are experiencing less sense of belonging. Sometimes sense of belonging can sound like it's a really qualitative or clinical subjective variable. And I highlight this to really emphasize the degree to which it is predictive of occupational choices, quote unquote. So in another line of work, we look at this more at an acute level. So that was STEM in general, experiencing bias or not. We were curious about, would this hold at the level of just a department, like a community of folks that is actually has more interpersonal connectedness, perhaps. So we replicate. This time we have a whole new set of stimulus materials to get at, does that broader process replicate? So this time participants are reading allegedly the reaccreditation review of a chemistry department. And in the bias condition, they read, amongst other neutral filler information, that the department has had a high number of gender bias related complaints and incidents over the last several years. And in the equality condition, everything is the same, except the department has not struggled with gender bias. Then we measure a host of DVs that we're often now borrowing from the IO and OB literature in organizations. So we're looking at anticipated discrimination, again, sense of belonging, positive attitudes this time towards the department, and then trust and comfort. And we find the same pattern. So in the bias condition, there is a gender gap. Now we're looking at anticipated discrimination. So really seeing very specifically drilling down to this variable, women are expecting more discrimination than men in the presence of bias, and this goes away in the presence of equality. And then same pattern for sense of belonging, this gender gap, right, goes away in the presence of equality. Same thing with positive attitudes towards the department, and same thing with trust and comfort. So these kinds of gaps that we see here and that are often talked about as inevitable, they're malleable, they're situational. They are a product of the social composition of that actual community or the environment that people find themselves in. And by the way, we don't have time for this today, but we find a similar pattern with men when we look at men applying for jobs in early education or more gendered healthcare professions, caregiving opportunities. We find the exact same thing. And we often will essentialize this difference as well, right? Well, men just they don't care, they can't, they don't have those skills, which is actually really insulting to everyone because it's not rocket science, it's practice. If you're talking about changing a diaper right? But we see that men do express interest in those caregiving roles when they don't expect that they will be discriminated against if they're excited about them. So we find the same mediational patterns. And so I'll add to our working summary as we're going. Gender bias is one cause of gender disparities. Hear from me right now, I am not claiming it is the only cause. There's an unfortunately rich palette of potential causes that have been identified in the literature, including role modeling effects, stereotype threat effects. This is one cause to add to our understanding. We're finding this direct experimental causal link between the existence of gender bias and the ways in which it's undermining women's enthusiasm for STEM. And I will highlight then that one thing that this means is that if we can look forward to making gender equality the reality, we might also have reason to be hopeful that it will remove barriers to women's engagement and full participation, right? That there's not something sort of inherent or inevitable about gender segregated interest, and that it is its own engine of reproducing many of the patterns that we're seeing. So for us, this really highlighted we need some interventions. We need some evidence-based interventions that can target gender bias in STEM. Now, this is an interesting moment in the United States to be talking about diversity interventions. So I'm very mindful of that. What I will say is that, so we developed a novel intervention in partnership with a lot of different folks. Our goal here was to develop an evidence-based STEM intervention. So we began with this literature review and sort of expectation setting, this piece that we published in Science, reviewing the existing literature, finding that there were very few diversity interventions at the time that were designed specifically for the STEM community, and that STEM participants really cared about that. They felt that more generalized interventions were not a good fit for them, again, because of their sort of objectivity and orientation towards data. And that there's, to put it mildly, mixed results on the effectiveness of traditional diversity interventions, which, by the way, is really true. It is a big problem. I wouldn't argue that it means that we should abandon the task of trying to address DEI-related challenges, but it does mean we need to do so in a robust, scientific, and evidence-based way. In part because some of those traditional approaches often imply blame and they bring up reactance in participants instead of engagement. And that's a shame. So what we tried to do was something a little bit different. We tried to utilize engrossing media as the forum for our intervention. There's a lot of research in my field to suggest that this is a good mechanism for reducing intergroup prejudice and conflict. And so what we did was partner with an interdisciplinary team to create what we call VIDs, Video Interventions for Diversity in STEM. These are 12 high-quality, 5-minute-long films. We partnered with a professional playwright from the Yale School of Drama who read the literature and co-conducted focus groups with us for folks working in STEM. And she wrote these scenes. We then worked with professional directors, actors, set lighting people, stuff that I did not learn to do in my graduate program, but was very interested in, to create these short films. Now, they communicate the published results of bias penalties for gender stereotype violations from my field of social psychology, but they convey that information in one of two ways. The first is the narrative condition. So these are 6 films that utilize engrossing stories about the life of a department. What can happen when people are actually working in STEM fields in an academic or healthcare provision setting. And these specific stories came from the focus groups. So they're evidence-based in multiple ways. They're supported at the aggregate level by published papers from my field. And then the particular storytelling mechanisms that she used are from the real lives of real men and women working in STEM fields. Then in the expert interview condition, we're sharing the same types of patterns of results and data, but we're doing so in a much more sort of scripted kind of way of there being still filmed with actors and the same film production crew, but it's much more, think of like a Diane Sawyer type interview, right? There's someone posing as a scientist who's kind of answering questions about the data. And we didn't know which would be more effective, particularly for a STEM audience. Would they like this more narrative approach or more expert interview? I wish I had time to show you some of the videos, but alas, I do not. But I will show you where you can get them in just a moment. But to give you a flavor for them, so this is from our narrative condition. Again, remember, these are compelling characters. They're graduate students, they're undergraduate students, faculty members, postdocs, folks working in a STEM department. And their stories are illustrating the results from the published literature, the social processes that we know are taking place. And then the expert interview condition is much more of just a straightforward interview telling about those same results, kind of more like what I've been doing with y'all today. But again, the underlying content is equivalent across conditions. So just for example, here's one of the target articles that we wanted to share the results of. The main finding is that there are penalties against women who violate gender stereotypes professionally, even when that is necessary for their professional success. In the expert interview condition, there's the actor posing as the scientist who just describes this. But in the narrative condition, we take a story that we got from some graduate students in a focus group, which was that during practice talks, they were getting ready to go to a conference. The department gave really positive feedback to a man who was behaving agentically, ambitiously, analytically, in a self-promoting way, and gave really negative feedback to a female graduate student who was doing something very, very similar. And so we have a scene in that narrative condition that acts out that story that happened to these real individuals. Is that making sense? Sort of how this is evidence-based in multiple ways. Oh, and I'll just note that vids are now freely available to researchers and educators. You can download them there from this website. They've been cited numerous times since we first shared them in 2017. Maybe they'll make like good bedtime viewing. I don't think they actually will. They'll raise your cortisol right up, but please use them. And we've heard from lots of folks now who've been using them in research and teaching more workshops formats. So please, they're all yours. All right, so the last sort of set of results that I'll tell you about before I open it up for questions. In our research, we've tested the efficacy of vids under many different conditions. I'll tell you about some of the most highly cited results, but I'm happy to chat about much more that we've done with vids. So in this first study, we also developed a control condition. These were clips from science documentaries that were pre-tested as equivalent to the intervention conditions. In many ways, they have the same number of male and female scientists present. They're pre-tested. They're rated as equally engrossing and informative, fun to watch, but they contain no information about gender bias. So in this first study, we have general population adult participants, and we have two data collection time points. We have one which is immediately post-intervention. So they watch this 5-minute film, and then we take these measurements. Then we follow up 6 months later. So this is something that we were pessimistic about. I don't know if a 5-minute film is going to have long-lasting results, but I'm going to give away a punchline right now in the interest of time and say we find no significant decay effects, meaning the effects at 6 months are not statistically weaker than they are immediately post. So that is saying that there's something durable about this intervention, at least at the 6-month marker, which is more longitudinal data than we ever usually get in my subfield, for better and for worse. So in this particular moment, I'll tell you about these 3 dependent variables: awareness of bias, gender bias itself as measured with our most common instrument, and then some action-oriented emotions of both anger and empathy. And so here's what we find. For awareness of bias, the narrative and expert interview films increase people's awareness of bias relative to the control. That's a good thing. That's almost a manipulation check. And we are also finding, though, that it is reducing gender bias itself, particularly for the expert interview condition here. The narrative to control difference is marginal. And the films are engaging these action-oriented emotions of anger as well as empathy. And it's the narrative films that are doing this most effectively. So the expert interview conditions are doing this as well. But the narrative, the stories, is particularly impactful in this sense. So upon seeing these first data, we thought that there was some interesting initial evidence that these could be useful evidence-based interventions, reducing gender bias, and that these effects were showing up 6 months later. But of course, there's numerous unanswered questions. And a huge one is, would these findings generalize to a STEM community, to STEM participants? So that's just the last study that I'll tell you about. Here we have, again, our participants are academic scientists. And now we have 3 time points. So I can tell you you about change from baseline. So we first measure them 1 week before the intervention. We then measure them right after, and now we have 1 week post. I know 1 week looks a little sad when compared to 6 months, but we could not get STEM faculty to follow up 6 months later. I mean, they needed time more than they needed any amount of money that we could pay them to participate at that point. So I'll show you change from baseline. And again, no significant decay effects at that 1 week post follow-up this time. So you'll see that people in the control condition, their awareness of bias actually went down a little bit over time. And the pattern is the opposite for folks who were viewing one of our intervention films. Now, this is sort of a general tendency that we find in the literature sometimes, that the control condition starts to look a little bit worse on some variables over time. The theory and hypothesizing behind this is that social desirability demands weaken a little bit over time. When you've been asked the same types of questions by the same researchers, you're less concerned about making yourself look good. You just sort of get fatigue for that. So if that's the general trend, not only are we increasing awareness, but we're doing so against a more fundamental tendency to actually look a little bit worse over time. We find the same thing for gender bias itself. So the narrative and expert interview films are both reducing gender bias relative to control, and expert interviews doing that particularly well for this STEM audience. And narrative films still particularly engaging these action-oriented emotions that we know from other work are very predictive of collective action designed to promote justice and fairness within organizations. Look at the control condition there. They got way less empathic over there. Yikes. Someone should study that. I'm kidding, they do. This is, it's from pre to post. So it's 1 week before and then 1 week after. So it's 2 week gap. Yep. Wouldn't it be great if we had more empathy? We'll talk about that another time. So to wrap up my summary, gosh, I can't punctuate this enough in this moment. We need evidence-based interventions. We need robust science around diversity interventions. We do not need best guesses anymore. We do not need interventions that are likely to backfire or that are very well intentioned but not tested. They have the potential to do much more harm than good. Sadly, I've been saying this for years, and unfortunately, this is a moment where I'm miserable to have been right. The backlash is massive. And unfortunately, it's justified in a scientific sense in that folks can point to the fact that we don't have evidence that a lot of what we've spent money on in terms of these interventions was producing the desired effects. Not because the desired effects aren't necessary or important, but because the approach to it has not been scientifically rigorous. And that is a tragedy. So I hope that there's a future in which we can dig into this work in a scientific and rigorous way. We do think that this particular example is interesting and maybe generative and promising in some particular ways. It's effective over time at increasing awareness and bias itself and also engaging these action-oriented emotions. We've got a lot of subsequent work with this module where we're looking at some unintended consequences, ways in which it can undermine women's sense of belonging. So pairing it with sort of a booster session that addresses that. But this is a lot of the ongoing work in my lab right now. So I will end with some major takeaways, big picture bullet points. One, there's evidence that penalties exist for gender stereotype violating interests. There's evidence that bias happens, even in analytic context, even amongst folks who really value their objectivity genuinely and who are trained to be evidence-based. There's bias. And that bias has consequences. And it doesn't just have consequences for the individuals whose own careers may be constrained. It also has consequences for the functioning of particular groups and organizations who want to hire the most talented and motivated people, and for whom access may be obstructed by the ways in which these biases are constraining individual careers. And I would argue for society as a whole, you saw the comments from those kiddos, right? They are picking up on those disparities and the ways in which biases are contributing to those disparities. They are feeling worried, as that kiddo shared. And there's some evidence that robustly designed, expensive to produce interventions may be useful at durably reducing some of these biases, but please hear from me. We need so much more work, and we need to not prematurely conclude that we have solved a problem. It is psychologically very tempting to think, it is palliative to think, oh my gosh, we've learned something about this. Now let's do something about this. That cannot be the mechanism. I say in every talk I give now, we need to think about this less on the scale of like a diversity, like some, cute thing we can kind of do to make ourselves more mindful of this. We need to think about it more. And I use this metaphor intentionally, especially for folks in this room. We need to think about it more on the scale of curing a major disease. This is a public health issue, and it is on the scale. We need the infrastructure that we do for tackling a more recognizable public health threat. That is the scale that we're talking about. It's not a hack. It needs a science to understand those processes. So I think I will actually leave it there for today. I want to thank my lab, my wonderful students, postdocs, and the funding sources for some of the work that I shared with you today. And most importantly, all of you for being here. And I'm be thrilled to hear your comments and questions in our remaining time. Thank you all so much. And I'm aware that, there may have been some comments online. I'm happy to chat.
Great. So we have a question from online. The question is, you mentioned a study that found countries that had stronger belief in gender trait stereotypes associated with success in STEM, such as analytical, logical, etc., resulted in lower achievement for women in STEM. How can we know which came first, the lower achievement or gender bias?
Yes, that's a great question. We cannot know. That is the most robust methodological response. This is a correlation. Absolutely. There is a lot of really interesting experimental work trying to tease those things apart because the origin is important, right? But in practice, at this point, there is a cyclical relationship. And I think some of my work speaks to the ways in which the existence of that bias can undermine achievement, but also the ways in which that lack of achievement can then feed back into those stereotypes. So we are very much at this point dealing with a wheel that has its own momentum. And I think the broader take here is trying to understand the ways in which each of those moments have their own predictive utility. Folks. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Alan.
Oh,
thank you very much. Really interesting. Excuse me for making maybe slightly cynical point. Could you comment on the people taking part in your training, how enthusiastic they were? Because I worry about training. If that's a compulsory thing to do, it's do it as quickly as possible and get onto the work I'm meant to be doing idea. So were they really committed? Because the videos seem to have a huge effect, but were they slightly self-selected and who volunteered to actually take part in the training?
Oh, such an important question. I could talk about this for 1,000 years, but I won't. I will really try to focus in on your question here. There is a lot of work, including my own and in other labs, that really demonstrates that buy-in has a huge impact on how successful diversity interventions are. Buy-in from the highest levels of the organization. We need to see modeling at those levels that this is actually valued, or it just becomes one more thing I have to cross off my list before I get to the work that I'm actually going to be evaluated for. I will say in these studies, we have, and many that I wasn't able to share with you today, we have a variety of different types of people exposed to these interventions in a variety of different kinds of conditions. Some of them are people that just chose to participate, so potentially self-selection effects, absolutely. Some of them are more in a STEM context where it was required, and many of them are in a STEM context where it was voluntary. So we've got people kind of across the continuum. And I'll say for this particular intervention, we don't find huge differences in effect size. So whether it was compulsory or not, but the broader literature does. So I think that there's reason to maybe be interested in that discrepancy, but really to take seriously the social context in which people are being exposed to these interventions matters tremendously. And that makes sense. If it didn't, we might not have the scope of these problems in the first place. So that's one of the reasons why I say we need to think about this on the scale of a much bigger problem, maybe, or a problem that is already very familiar to us, and maybe even in a thornier way, because we're not just giving a drug, right? We're giving an intervention that people are thinking about and experiencing on a cognitive and physical sometimes level. And so I think it gets really, really thorny, and we just don't have enough work. because I think it's tempting to think that it would be easy. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, in the back. Maybe we can, pass that back. Sorry.
So I can imagine in a completely unethical place where you could segregate
Say
a
more.
group of children and raise them from birth or as close to that moment as you could possibly get and do a longitudinal and maybe even a generational study if you had enough scientists who would be willing to devote their lives and then the possible lives of another generation of scientists to looking at this question in a completely empirical way. So you've already identified many of the ways in which you are being able to correlate in less than ideal experimental conditions for a certain definition of ideal. So as you're going forward, are your plans really looking at more ethically framed longitudinal study? And I'm very interested in finding out more because honestly, one of the main reasons this has never been tested is because it's been very hard to test.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So sometimes I'll get a version of this question where someone will say, are you worried that you're telling everyone about the reality of gender bias, given that you now know that it can undermine women's interest in STEM? And I think that's a really important question. I think it speaks to somewhat of the spirit of your question, which I'll also answer directly. And in my thinking about this, I've taken this really seriously because we do know that there's an impact. But I would say, I think history suggests that ignoring the reality of discrimination does not actually make it go away, doesn't make it better. And I think there's lots of work in my field to suggest that when we don't talk about these broader trends, then people are prone to making individual attributions when they encounter discrimination. They think, oh, it's me, there's something wrong with me, I don't belong, I can't hack it, rather than, oh, I know people have talked about there's this broader process here. So that informs my thinking about the ethics of it to some degrees. We need to be talking about this. And hey, if we can say we have a value as a STEM community that there should be egalitarianism, that there should be fairness, we know that's likely to engage folks' interest as well. So in terms of your more specific question of sort of how we're thinking about these manipulations or the various experimental universes that we could live in, I will say that my focus right now has really been largely in thinking about segregation broadly across the gender identity spectrum and how to develop robust interventions, in part because it's really hard to manipulate the existence of bias in numerous different ways that one can still feel ethically positive about. It's an area where I think there's some other folks who are doing more work, so I'd be happy to chat more. But I've been really focused on trying to think about interventions. And funding for that is now gone. So that's a whole nother conversation that we could have. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions in this room? I have a million questions. So maybe I'll grab the mic and ask one or two before we run out of time.
Yeah.
First of all, just thank you for this amazing body of work. And let's just hope that we can bide our time and it'll continue to flourish.
Yeah.
One is, I'm sure you've been interested in extending this video approach to people of color.
Yeah.
Has there been any research? Have you been able to make the videos and do any of that work yet?
Yes. So we are in the middle stages of developing this intervention for men in more caregiving or feminized occupations. So using a really similar approach to thinking about reducing biases against men, going into early education, nursing, and we're in a slightly even earlier phase of doing this in a targeted way around racialized stereotypes and also biases against queer folks and folks with physical disabilities and movement challenges. Again, some of that funding is just very challenging and difficult in this current moment. So the race project is being stalled in ways that you might be able to anticipate. I will say also, I had always intended to replicate that very first study, the John Jennifer study, looking at other forms of marginalization. So looking at the race of the applicant. And we set out to do that study immediately after the first one was published. And it's one of the major regrets of my career that we didn't collect that data before publishing. I could not have anticipated the kind of firestorm and coverage that initial study received. So the participant pool was completely polluted. So when we started doing pilot data for the race version, everyone was like, this is the John Jennifer study, but with race, right? And I was like, well, we can no longer study this. Some folks have, and what they found is that people actually kind of bend over backwards to make a more fair, equitable choice, which is its own interesting question. That's posing a question of what do scientists do when they know that you are measuring their biases? And so maybe it's interesting to think, well, they kind of compensate or they present themselves in a socially desirable way, but that's different than do they have biases? That's a really different question. So
Well,
I wish we had.
Yeah, that actually leads me into one other question that I think will be of interest to everybody, which is, we have had affirmative action for more than a generation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some pushback to the notion of gender bias in STEM from, basic findings about rates of successful grant applications, rates of successful tenure track hiring that are often used to challenge work like yours. So can you just enlighten this audience about your response to those?
Absolutely. I really welcome those kinds of conversations because I think too often people just sort of retreat to their own cognitive conclusions and don't subject them to the light of day. So I love when people pose these questions. I really welcome it. Absolutely. When you see correlational data about real career trajectories, and people can sort of quibble over the ways in which to best conduct those statistical analyses or models, it can be really hard to determine, is there an effect here? Is there an effect of gender bias? That is the primary reason why I did that first study, is we want to know, cool, at the end of the day, are we evaluating equivalently qualified targets equivalently? And we're not. We don't find evidence that that's the case. And that's been replicated a lot of times. So what I always say when someone will bring up a question like that is we need to consider multiple kinds of data and multiple sources of evidence when we're looking at a real world problem like this. Given that we know that there's this experimental reality, we shouldn't assume that bias isn't playing a role in real careers, if that makes sense. And I think that that's been a neglected part of the conversation. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about like our last vice president that we had, and I just felt like wondering like, could she have made like a difference in like our point of views? I'm like, if she's not good enough, then will this bias ever go away, or is this just a problem we'll have for the rest of our life? Like once you open Pandora's box, there's no closing it. Because and also my mom, like she's a computer science like engineer, so I never really thought that me being what I am is gonna get in the way of me achieving my goals, which I ended up going to medicine, not computer science, but too much math. But yeah, I never really saw what I am is like a burden. It's not until like you get into like higher education where it's not like an actual problem. It's just people keep talking about it. I'm like, well, that's not my experience. And I'm like, the world we're living in, I'm seeing certain things, why can't you? And it's kind of confusing. So I just kind of like, at this point, I'm gonna just do what I'm gonna do and not worry about everybody else around me. Like if I'm the smartest one in the room, that's fine with me.
Yeah.
That's why I'm going to be a doctor and like be in charge of these people that probably aren't thinking on that level.
I really appreciate this comment.
Yeah, and this at this point it just feels like pure ignorance because I knew since I was 5 years old that who you are shouldn't get in the way of what you want to do in life if you really want to do it. And if somebody that's in their 50s or older than that doesn't know that yet, then I don't know what to say.
Yeah. Thank you for that really poignant comment. That really resonates. I would say two major things, and then I know we're tight on time. One, there is always going to be differences between the aggregate data and individual lives and case studies, right? And so it's heartening in this case to hear that your experience doesn't match those aggregate results in some ways. There's so much variability in the way these things play out in the real world. What I would say, though, your initial question makes me really think about, there's a lot of research on the impacts of representation. Like what is the impact of there being a counter stereotypic historically person in a particular role? Is that enough? People studied what they called the Obama effect when Obama was first elected. Is basically, is this going to cure racism in the United States? I think we know the answer. But what I will say, there's a ton of research on this, and what the research says in a nutshell is that representation is absolutely important. It is really essential, and it is insufficient. It is an important step, and it is not enough. So when there is no one to look at, or there is no one pushing assumptions about who can be where and doing what, that's really harmful. It's harmful to folks looking up and trying to come up. But it is nowhere near enough. It sets a playing field that then can play out in numerous different ways based on all of these other processes. So I hate to leave you on that incredibly down note, but I'm gonna and say have a great day. In addition to that, thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the fight continues. So I just want to say a couple quick things. One, today's session is worth one continuing education credit. It's a 1 hour session, not two. Obviously, we want to thank Dr. Moss-Racusin for joining us. We have a little bit of a swag bag with our WISH logo and some Rosalind Franklin, and including a book by Amy Deal, who was our speaker at the symposium on gendered leadership. And so it's been a great year studying gender roles under the microscope. Please stay tuned for next year when WISH will address women's leadership. And as always, I just need to shout out to our incredible staff and WISH team that makes this all possible. So thanks. Thank you so much.